Okay, welcome everybody to our, our second seminar of our Horizons STEM HE network series. And this is going to be on gaining ethical approval for pedagogical research and the scholarship of teaching and learning. And this, in a way, came out a little bit of some of the discussion we had in our first seminar about what sort of support people need in doing scholarship of teaching and learning. So we can move on to the next slide. I just want to give some general background to our network for those that might be joining for the first time. So the key aims are to sort of build a network of people with interested in the scholarship of teaching and learning within the STEM discipline. And, you know, one feature of that is then to disseminate good practice that actually enhances teaching and learning and the student experience. And perhaps the next one is the key one, which our seminars addressing, is a key part of that is to supporting the best practice in evaluation and pedagogical research, you know, which are sort of aspects of scholarship of teaching and learning. And I think what we found is actually designing projects, getting approval for ethical, for pedagogical research projects can sometimes be a bit of a new experience to STEM academics. You know, if you're working in the humanities or in health, you might be very used to getting ethical approval. But for STEM academics familiar with science, engineering, computing, maths sort of research, it might be a new thing. So hopefully, Pedro is going to give us a flavour of what's entailed in gaining ethical approval. I'm sure we'll talk about our own practices at Kingston University, but a lot of that will transfer to other institutions. And then finally, through our seminars, and this will be perhaps a feature of future seminars, we're trying to get collaboration across STEM disciplines. So we might have some networking activities where academics from different disciplines, different universities can interact within one of our seminars. Next slide, please. Just a couple of house rules about our Zoom setup. We've only got registered participants, but there's a standard thing about muting. So we ask people to mute themselves so you don't get any background noise. This session will be recorded, so if you particularly don't want to see your face appearing, please turn off your video. And at the moment, the only people being able to share the screen are myself and the presenter, Pedro. The chat function will be available, and I think Pedro might be asking some for feedback from the chat. Is that correct, Pedro?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, so that will be accessible. It is nice to see your faces, but as I said, if you don't want to be seen or appear in any video, turn it off. And so a final reminder, just so it's very clear, this session is recorded because we do want to make this available to people that can't make today's seminar, and that video will ultimately be posted on our website. Okay, if we go back to our first slide, Sarah. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Pedro Barra, who's really the ethical approval lead in my old school of life sciences, pharmacy and chemistry. So I think he's very used to gaining or reviewing sort of pedagogical research projects coming from science practitioners who might have varying degrees of experience and expertise in this area. And he's a very thorough reviewer because I can experience some of the comments I've got back in some of my projects. But as a key thing about ethical approval is actually it's supportive and helpful, and actually what it normally does is actually improve the research project. So that's something to bear in mind, even though there are maybe lots of demands or whatever. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Pedro.
Thank you, Neil. I'll start off by just thanking the organizers for the Horizons STEM HE network for the invitation to talk to you today. So as Neil said, I'm a member of staff at Kingston University. I'm an associate professor there. I'm also the faculty research ethics lead. So all applications that come through our faculty of health, science, social care and education will ultimately land on my inbox. And then I have a team of specialist reviewers that go through those applications. And then we together pull what we think is constructive feedback for applicants, which invariably would be asked to resubmit the application with changes or comments or clarifications on anything that they've submitted as part of the application. So I deal with maybe around 60 to 70 applications per year around all areas covering my faculty. And the proportion of those will be applications from staff who are involved in pedagogical research as well. So what I've got planned for today is I've got a small Mentimeter activity to start off the session. And then I also have a series of slides. And I've got a case study, which I hope will bring together different scenarios that you might encounter as you try to embark within pedagogical research, looking at using institutional data for research, but then also using data that you might be collecting as part of a project within pedagogical research. So I'm going to try and share my screen. I'm familiar with Teams, so I'm more hoping that this will work as well. And it'll be my Mentimeter activity first. So hopefully you'll be able to see something on the screen. I'm going to click on present mode. We should make this go full screen. So I'm hoping that this will work. So you can just scan the QR code there. You can also go on the website and join via that code there. So I'll give you a few seconds just to join in. If you can click on the working sign or the little corner there, just to tell me that it's working. I have an idea of how many people have joined in. I just want to get a flavor of your experience, if any, in terms of dealing with ethics applications. Okay. So I think I'll move on. I think you'll be able to see the instructions on all the slides as well. So the first slide is just to have an idea of your experience of dealing with ethics applications, whether you've submitted them, whether you've reviewed them as well, and maybe you act as a reviewer within your faculty, school, and or university, or whether you have no experience previously of submitting ethics applications or reviewing. Okay. Okay, so the mix there of submitting and reviewing applications as well. The next one is questions just find out a bit more about what you experience, what you feel when you are about to submit an ethics application. So I've got 3 options there. Just want to see what you typically feel when it's about time to submit an ethics application, or that you know you have to submit one. So those options were all made up, and I can give you a quick idea that I made them up by asking AI what people might feel when submitting applications on ethics, and to give it a humorous view. And these were the options that came up from AI, and I thought that they were well much applicable to ethics. Okay, running for the hills is cardio. Okay, next one. Describe your experience with ethics application in 1 word. I know the text box gives you the option to write 200 words. Please don't. Just what do you feel when it's about time to submit an ethics application? Okay. Okay, I can't see any sort of positive feelings coming from the text there around ethics applications. Okay, I'll try and address some of those as we go along, but I just want to have a view of your experience. Next one, what is the biggest challenge you face when applying for ethical approval? So what's the thing that tends to delay things the most? The thing that takes the longest amount of time? Okay, so time. Okay. Data management, we'll talk about that as well. Waiting for approval, it can take quite a long time. Ethics committee set up for research, not undergraduate projects. In our university, we have a system of delegation to module teams, especially on dissertation modules, where we ask those module teams to review applications coming from students on undergraduate projects or taught master's projects as well. And the idea is that the module team, who has to go through training as well, then is responsible for working within the parameters set for them. They are able to review and issue a favorable ethical opinion for undergraduate projects. If there are concerns that the projects work with outside, or the risk is higher than what would be expected for an undergraduate project, then it comes to us. But the idea is that we would not be able to cope with the volume of undergraduate applications if we had to review them all. at specific times of the year. Okay, so time seems to be a common concern there. Next one, how does your university handle ethical approval for pedagogical research? Is it handled together with everything else, or do you have a separate committee that deals with pedagogical research? So what's the format that you experience in your institution? At Kingston, it comes to us as normal, so there is no pedagogical research from staff throughout the year. Normally, it would come to us. Online form. Okay, we'll also talk about how it gets submitted as well. One committee for everything, faculty as normal. Okay, that's very much our experience as well. And then the last one is like a type question, series of statements. How confident do you feel in your understanding of the ethical approval requirements? If you're satisfied with the communication and feedback. So this is around the feedback you get from them rather than the time it takes for you to get feedback from them. You receive adequate support from the institution, and the ethical approval process does not significantly delay my research. Okay, so the last one is not surprising because time came up quite often on one of the previous questions. So you're happy, you have a good understanding. Communication could perhaps be better. There's some degree of support from the institution that could be better. And time is the main issue here in terms of impacting upon the speed at which you can do research. Okay, so I'll try and talk through some of those as you go through the presentation. So I'm going to close the slides and move on to another application. I can just find the buttons again. Give me a second. I'm going to close this and go to my slides. Again, I'm happy to share the slides with you as well afterwards. So I'm just going to ask just for you to check if it's full screen for you. Is it okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So what we'll do is, we've had the Mentimeter extravaganza already. I'm going to talk a little bit about research ethics in general, then the joys of GDPR. Then I'll talk about some of the types of data that we may find ourselves gaining access to for educational research. And then I've got a case study completely made up of a Dr. Z who works at University Z. And then obviously we'll have time for Q&A. I won't be able to see the questions you write on the side of the Zoom as we go through the presentation, but I'll work through them at the end of the presentation. So if questions come up, just by all means do write them there, and I'll try to deal with them as well as I get to the end of the presentation. So the first thing is to consider the research ethics review process as we know it. So we know that we need to go through it because we are it is our duty to protect participants, but also researchers in the university. And the research, therefore, has to go through an appropriate ethical scrutiny. This ethical scrutiny has to take place before any study begins. And so before you even approach your first participant, the ethical approval must be in place. And that's the time, during that period of time when you are thinking about your research, that you reflect on any ethical issues that you might encounter. And you need to find ways to justify your procedures from an ethical perspective so that you can proceed with your application as well. Your application is then either submitted as a series of documents by email to a committee for consideration, and some universities may have their dedicated online portal, like we have at Kingston, where all the submission is made through this portal. There's a series of boxes you have to complete, almost like if the Word document form had been complete or converted to an online form. And then you attach any required paperwork that comes with it. So your participant information sheet, consent forms, surveys, recruitment materials, anything you might be using for your research. Then the review takes place either at the more local level, it might be a school or faculty level, or there is maybe one committee overall that looks at all applications across the institution. That committee will have a series of staff coming from various schools, various faculties, and you will have a series of perhaps specialist reviewers whose role is to review those applications. They might be reviewed outside the committee, or they might be then discussed at committee level as well. So the approval can take place in those meetings, or they can take place online via the online portal as well. Some institutions will have a year-round delegation. So in other words, we can submit at any point of the year and your applications are reviewed as they are submitted, or they may have a series of designated dates published in advance, and you know you're working towards that particular date in order to complete or submit your application. This is roughly what happens, I think, in most institutions. So we've gone through variations of this over time at Kingston as well, where we had just specified dates, and now we have a system where you can, at any point of the year, submit an application for it to be reviewed by a panel. There's a number of things that we all take into consideration as we go through our ethical reflection of what our research might encounter. We look at autonomy. We're trying to ensure that our participants, obviously the choice to participate is theirs, and that choice may be free from coercion. Coercion, which might be something that we don't realize is happening. So for example, when we offer financial incentives for people to participate, the financial incentive might be so large that it might be impossible for the participant to refuse participation, and so that consent is not really freely given. The other thing to consider perhaps in pedagogical research is that if we invite our students to be part of our research and participants in our research, they may feel slightly coerced to participate because we are their lecture or module leader or course leader. So we're going to have to consider whether the consent, their consent is freely given in those circumstances. We're always trying to ensure that we protect the welfare, the well-being of the participants, and we're also trying to make sure that we don't cause harm to those that choose to participate in our research. This is not to say that our research is going to directly benefit them, and in fact, most often there might be not any direct benefits to the participants, but the idea is that there might be an altruistic sense of helping out to increase our understanding of a particular area, and maybe that's the advantage that participants may get from participating in our research. In terms of non-maleficence, again, we're trying to ensure that there is no harm caused to the participant. This is not the same thing as saying that there is no risk from participating in your research. What we have to make sure is that we've contemplated all possible risks that are happening. We're trying to ensure that those risks are not higher than those that would normally occur in normal daily life. And when the risks are present, that we make sure that the participants are aware and are able to understand and ask questions about the level of risk attached to them participating in our research. At the same time, we need to make sure that we protect the participants' privacy as they participate in our research as well. So sort of the sense of justice, this is something that we have in mind as well. I also want to touch upon the differences and distinctions between research ethics and GDPR. So it's important for us to know that GDPR is not there because of research ethics. GDPR applies to any sector in society that handles personal data from any living identifiable individual. We have to consider the GDPR as part of research ethics, but we don't have to consider GDPR because necessarily of research ethics. So I've got a little bit of a distinction between the two. So GDPR is very much focused on data protection, privacy rights, and is focused on what we call personal data. Whereas research ethics is very much looking at protecting human dignity, well-being, and their rights. The scope of GDPR is personal data. The scope of research ethics, whilst it looks at data as well, is focusing on the physical safety, psychological well-being, social impact, moral questions raised by our research. There are a series of legal requirements around GDPR, whereas around research ethics, we've got a series of moral, ethical principles. So they extend far beyond what are the legal requirements. The GDPR applies in the whole of the European Union, and in the UK, we abide by it as part of the UK Data Protection Act from 2018, whereas research ethics applies universally, regardless of the location in which the research takes place. And we have obviously then, because there are legal requirements for GDPR, we have authorities, organizations responsible for that. And then in terms of oversight for research ethics, we often will have our research ethics committee, institutional review boards that deal with that. So researchers need to ensure as part of their application for research ethics that they meet both ethical standards and also GDPR. And again, it's important to note that a study may be GDPR compliant. In other words, everything is in place to protect the privacy and confidentiality of the data that you've got in front of you. But it may be that the study is unethical, or it is deemed to be unethical, not approved, because, for example, it failed to convey to the participants the degree of risk associated with participating. At the same time, we may have a study that is ethically sound, and we can approve it on the basis of that, but it needs additional measures. So for example, the researchers have not indicated how they'll ensure that the data is protected from unauthorized access. They haven't indicated how they're going to protect the data, where they're going to store the data, how they will encrypt the data. And so we can't approve it on the basis of that, but everything else will be ethically sound. By the way, all of those infographics you can see in front of you were created using Claude 3.5. Now, I said GDPR focuses on personal data. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about personal data and sort of data which is a bit more sensitive, because we will encounter that in pedagogical research. So personal data looks at information that relates to an individual, that is a living individual that can be identifiable on the basis of the data we collect from that particular person. It doesn't need to be something as obvious as their name, but it can also be a combination of data that when pulled together would allow us to identify the individual. So even though it might not be on the list that I'm going to show you in a couple of seconds, it may be that other data that is not there can be pulled together to allow you to identify that particular individual. Now, data that you have pseudo-anonymized or you have encrypted can still remain personal data if someone else can reverse that process. If someone can de-encrypt the data or find the encryption key for the data, if someone can find the document that creates the link between the information that you gathered from an interview and the participant, even though you've anonymized or pseudo-anonymized the data, if they can reverse that anonymization, the data remains personal data. However, if it's irreversible, you cannot go back from that anonymized data set to the individual. That personal data that you may have had before is no longer considered to be personal data because everything has been made anonymous. So these are the examples that come within the guidance from the European Commission around personal data. And I think, we can add things like a student identifier number. In Kingston will be the Kingston ID number. An individual from Kingston would be able to identify that individual on the basis of their Kingston ID, although it might not be possible for someone outside Kingston to identify them. So again, something to consider. We also have other types of data that I'll talk about slightly later on. There is, let's say, special, more sensitive data, and we will have to think about how we have the right to process that data. Now, I'm assuming if you've submitted ethics applications, you may have come across a question on the ethics form that asks you, what is your lawful basis to process personal data? And this comes from the Article 6 of the UK GDPR. And you probably come across those 6 different lawful basis for processing data. And often what tends to happen in research is that you tend to select public task and also consent as your reasons or your lawful basis for processing personal data. So you can process that data just as long as you identify what is the reason or the lawful basis for you to process that data. If there is any other day or any other data, or any other way you could process that data without requiring personal data, then it means that you don't have a lawful basis for processing that piece of data. So if you can obtain the same information without asking for personal data, then the question will be, why do you need the personal data? So you need to have a lawful basis for processing, asking and processing that data. For research, tends to be public task and consent. There's also what we call GDPR special category data. And while some of these might not be data that you might encounter on pedagogical research, things like racial or ethnic origin might be a type of data that you may encounter if you're looking, for example, of attainment gap between students of different demographic backgrounds. So for this one, not only do you have to indicate what is one of the 6 lawful bases for processing personal data, you also have to indicate an additional separate condition for processing special category data. So there are 10 different conditions you can rely on in order to justify your need to process special category data. So if you have personal data revealing racial or ethnic origin, on your ethics form, you're probably going to be asked, what is your lawful basis for processing that piece of data? And you will often be one of those 10 reasons there, which is on Article 9. For us, often what you will say is that you've got the explicit consent of the participant for you to be able to process that special category data, or you may also have reasons of substantial public interest. And it gets further complicated from here, because if you say it's explicit consent and reasons of substantial public interest, you're also going to be asked to further justify why you are invoking reasons of special or substantial public interest. So this gets, and then from this point onwards, you've got 23 extra conditions. And at that point in time, the one that matters to us will be able to say that not only do I have the consent of the individual to process their special category data, ethnicity data, I also have reasons of substantial public interest. And the reason is under journalism, academia, art, and literature. So you can invoke that reason to say this is the lawful basis under which I am processing special category data. Now, you may ask yourselves why educational research is treated differently regarding research versus any other fields. Anyone who submits within our faculty goes to the same panel, gets reviewed by the same reviewers. The reviewers are available at that point in time, and the process is exactly the same. There are no additional requirements for staff or students who are doing educational research with academic staff as part of undergraduate projects or summer placement projects or postgrad dissertations as well. So the way they get treated is exactly the same. There are no additional conditions attached to educational research that would not exist for other types of research as well. The next thing is to, before we go on to the case study, is I want to focus on the types of data that you may have already access to within your institution. So I've tried to organize them into 60 areas, and there's quite a fair amount of overlap between all of those. We've got academic records, personal information, engagement data, performance metrics, support services data, and behavioral data. This is the sort of data that the university collects. So it's not data that you are collecting yourself, including your module grades. This is data that the university is collecting. You have access to this data, and theoretically, you would be able to use this data for academic research. So maybe you use looking at attendance records, you might be looking at online learning participation, attendance online, digital footprints. You might be looking at analytics from your VLE as well. You might be looking at course completion rates, progression from year to year, outcomes, depending on the types of assessments that are taking place. All of this data is already available via the university. So the question is whether you do have access to that data. And if you do have access, how do you request access to that data? So the question here is whether your university has a privacy notice that specifically mentions, and I'll give you an example of one at Kingston, that you can use data collated from students for academic research, for research purposes. So Kingston University and its privacy notification indicates that, or tells students that we can use their data for a variety of different purposes, one of which is research, which includes academic research. So the question for you is whether your university's privacy notification indicates that that data collected by the university around all sorts of interactions with students can be used for academic research. And if it can, then the next question for you would be who to ask permission to use that data and what do you need to do, and whether you also need to put together an ethics application for use data collected by the university. So in a way, you're using secondary data for the purpose of academic research. So in order for us to go through this, I've got a series of case studies that I want you to go through. I would ask that you write your answers on the chat, and then I'll go through the answers to all of those questions in line with what happens at Kingston. Okay, so it's also worth noting that there's a separation between data collected by the university and the ability for us to mix it with additional data collected by us as part of our research project. So this may or may not impact, we'll see through the case study, whether we need ethical approval for that type of research. So what I've done is created a fictitious scenario of an academic called Dr. Z, and he works at the Department of Education at University Z. And this academic has noticed a decline in student engagement performance on a module called Introduction to the Horror of Statistics. I think we all know why perhaps the students weren't doing so well, but this academic wants to find out a bit more about whether they can improve the performance on the module. So he wants to move away from traditional exams to a combination of continuous assessments and project-based learning. And his objective is to evaluate how this new assessment strategy affects student engagement, overall satisfaction, and overall performance on their particular module. So the question I ask you is whether Dr. Z would be required to submit an ethics application to their university in order to be able to proceed with this research. So in order to expand on this, I'm going to give you 3 scenarios. And what I want you to tell me is which of those 3 scenarios, if any or all, would require an ethics application in your institution in order for you to be able to proceed with research trying to answer the question posed by Dr. Z here. So these are the 3 scenarios. In scenario 1, the data required is all institutional data. So this is all data around performance, grades from previous year students and the new year students. Also looking at VLE analytics as a way to measure engagement with the subject matter, and also looking at end of module evaluation questionnaire scores. Again, this is run by the university, not run by the academics. And they also want to look at those module evaluation questionnaire scores run at the end of the module to look at their levels of satisfaction between students who did the module the year before when they had to do traditional exams and its current year when those changes will be embedded. So this is the first scenario. So the question is whether they need ethics approval for their project when they're using institutional data only. The next one is not only does Dr. Z want to use institutional data, but Dr. Z also wants to use a pre and post intervention anonymous surveys that Dr. Z has put together to measure students' expectations, views, engagement, satisfaction at the beginning and the end of the module in the year where these changes were enacted. And on the third scenario, Dr. Z wants to again use the same data as for scenario 1, but this time they are not using anonymous surveys. They are doing a number of different either interviews or focus groups. So they want to gather more qualitative feedback directly with students. And so they're wondering whether to do some interviews and or do some focus groups. So I'm going to ask you just, and I can't see the chat at this point in time. Actually, I can probably click here. Whether you can indicate on the chat which of those options, how many of those options you think would require ethics approval by a University Research Ethics Committee. And again, please bear in mind that I'm going to answer the question on the basis of what happens at Kingston. The behavior at different universities might differ, so it might be that certain universities may require or not the same scenarios to be going through ethical review. I'm being able to open the chat. I'm not sure if the chat is now on top of the slides, but I'm just having a quick look at the chat as well. Got scenarios 2 and 3, 1 no, 2 not sure, 3 yes. Internal auditing, publisher research. Okay, we'll touch upon that as well. Okay, so one of the questions that have come up on the chat is around whether this is evaluation or research. Now, if what Dr. Z wanted to do was simply to evaluate the impact of a change made on their module, and they want to see whether it's improved the outcomes of those modules. So this is simply an evaluation activity, not deemed to be a research activity. There's no research question as such. Then they would not need to secure ethical approval. A university research ethics committee deals with research and not with something that will be deemed to be just evaluation of practice. We're all able to do that. Of course, we have to make sure that we conduct this evaluation in an ethical way. This is not the same thing as saying that evaluation is the same as research. So we will be focusing on assuming that what Dr. Z is doing is research. And again, this also answers the question around whether they want to publish. Theoretically, if they wanted to publish as a piece of research, then it might be that some of those would require ethical approval. I'll try to go through the various scenarios and give an indication of what might happen if it was a Kingston. So the question I asked you, let me just hide the chat again, is whether ethical approval will be needed. Now at Kingston, ethical approval will be needed for scenarios 2 and 3, but not for scenario 1. Now, so the member staff, because of the privacy notice, is able to use the anonymized data coming out from institutional service, from planning office, for example, they're able to use that data if made anonymous immediately post-download. They're able to use that for academic research because it is covered by the privacy notice for Kingston. However, the moment they then engage in additional data collection and they're using data which is not being collated, pulled together by the university, and it is data pulled together by themselves because they put together or they created a survey or they're running interviews or they're running focus groups, then they would require ethical scrutiny. And so they would need to submit that to an ethics committee for a review. Now I'll come up with what might happen if in scenario one, were they wanting to publish this in a journal and the journal indicated that they needed evidence of ethical scrutiny. So this is the advice that will be given at Kingston. Also worth noting that if they wanted to use institutional data for the purpose of research, even though it's covered by academic, by the privacy notice, our GDPR office would advise them to put a privacy notice also on the module to say that data collated from the module, for example, learning analytics and the grades for students, would be used for academic research, and to indicate to the students how the data would be used, what was the lawful basis for using that data, if there were any data sharing agreements, and how long the data will be retained. So even though it was covered by privacy notice, the advice from the GDPR office is to still make a privacy notice available on the module website to indicate what data was going to be used and for what purpose. Now, if a journal then comes back to you and says, we need evidence of ethical scrutiny having taken place before the project started. Now, this is the approach we take at Kingston. Now, the University Research Ethics Committee chair can issue a letter to indicate that this type of research is covered by our privacy notice, and therefore we would not go through a process of ethical scrutiny for this type of data because it's already covered under the privacy notification. However, you would have needed to have asked this letter before you started your research, and the chair of the ethics committee would only write that letter if you could confirm that the data was going to be completely anonymous, that it will be impossible to identify any participants from any resulting report, and that the use of the data would not cause any substantial damage or distress to any of the participants that took place in that particular project. This means that you can't just go ahead and analyze the data and retrospectively ask for their letter in case you need it. You will need to ask for the letter before you start the research as well. The other thing that might be worth looking at as well is whether the publication of this piece of research would bring will highlight any reputationally sensitive findings that should not be shared with the wider sector. So perhaps you would need to obtain approval or agreement from the dean or the university before that would get published. It's also possible that the journal may say, we do not accept that letter, and we actually want your project to have gone through ethical scrutiny. So the advice here is that you may still, whilst not needed for the purpose of your university, because a journal where you are hoping to publish that research may request that they, or may say that they want ethical scrutiny, not simply a letter to say it is exempt from ethical scrutiny, you may wish to apply for ethics and indicate on the reason why you're doing so, because we'll come back to you to say, but you don't need this, indicate that you have been asked to do that by the journal that you've identified as a possible place for publication of the research findings at the end of the project. And also, again, worth noting that you can't wait until you've done your research to say, well, I now need ethical scrutiny to take place. I'm going to go back retrospectively to the committee to do that. We would not be looking at granting ethical approval retrospectively for any work that's been done. So again, this means that you have to think about what you might need in advance of you starting research, which may be exempted from going through a full ethical approval within your institution. Now, I'm going to expand Dr. Z's research journey further. I'm going to ask you for 3 different answers for these questions. Stage 1. Now, Dr. Z has decided that they are concerned that only looking at data for 1 year after implementing the changes may not be sufficient to suggest that perhaps the changes in outcomes are to do with the changes implemented within that module. Maybe something to do with that cohort. Maybe Dr. Z has an idea that this cohort is stronger than the previous cohort, and maybe that's the reason why they're doing better. So they want to extend their research for an additional year. But let's assume that they put together an ethics application, and they said they were only going to recruit data for 2024-25, but not for 25-26. They've now decided they want to do 25-26 as well. At the same time, they have a new member of staff that they want to add to their research team. The research team was essentially Dr. Z and no one else. They want to add an additional member of staff to the research team. That means they have to go back to the original application, think about making changes, not just to the length of the time of data collection, but also the research team. Would they need a new ethics application, or would there be a simplified way to make changes to the previously approved application so they can carry on and collect data for another year and add another member of staff? So I'm going to ask you to write it on the chat. Okay, so yes. So we have systems in place where we simply ask them to request an amendment to the original application, and we just want them to indicate, and obviously those are the common reasons why applications tend to be extended, need more time for recruitment, change in research team. An amendment is a quick thing to do. It doesn't go through often through ethical committee approval. It might just going on to the committee chair or the faculty research ethics lead, and they would look at the changes, and if they're minor changes, this will often get approved quite quickly. The next one is next stage of Dr. Z's research journey. So on the next stage, Dr. Z has finished his previous research and is now gained interest on a new topic, which is generative AI, an impact on learning and teaching across HE. So he's identified a couple of colleagues in other universities, which I'll call universities W and V. And these are doctors W and V, just to make it easier. And so he wants to do a cross-university or cross-institution collaboration involving universities Z, W, and V. First question for you, where would Dr. Z apply for ethical approval? Would they apply at their institution, or would Dr. Z have to apply at all institutions at the same time? So the PI is Dr. Z. So because the PI is Dr. Z, Dr. Z will have to apply at their institution. So that will be the initial application. On that particular application, answering now the second question, they will need to name Dr. W and Dr. V. So they will name all the collaborating institutions, all the collaborators, with one single application to the institution where the PI works, which is Dr. Z. So the next question is whether universities W and V also need full applications submitted to those institutions, or whether there will be a different mechanism to gain approval for conducting research also at universities W and V. I think we have an answer already. So correct. So what will happen, and this is what happens at Kingston as well, there's a much simplified system where for previously approved applications or applications approved elsewhere, which might include, for example, the NHS, what we need is for evidence or all the paperwork submitted to the original institution where the PI works to be submitted to us with confirmation that it was approved, and also for us to see that all the collaborators are named in those applications. That also means that recruitment cannot start at universities W and V until such time as ethical approval has been granted on universities W and V. We don't do all the applications at the same time, because what will happen is one institution would say, for example, we are happy with the participant information sheet. We are happy to provide a favorable ethical opinion to this research. And then institution V would say, we are not happy with this participant information sheet, please change it. And then this will require an amendment to the paperwork approved in institutional Z. So we don't want that to happen. The next question is, there going to be a lot of data generated by this project, and they'll be collated at universities Z, W, and V. Do we need a data transfer agreement for the data to be transferred from, for example, institutions W and V to institution Z, where the data analysis is taking place? So this is effectively a GDPR question. Now, we can make the assumption, and I think it's a reasonable assumption we would make, probably because we would expect that to happen, that all the data shared between institutions is completely anonymous. It'll be impossible to identify anyone from institutions W, V, and Z on the basis of the data that is being shared. And provided the data is protected and can only be accessible by the researchers named in the application, then in theory, that should be fine. However, our GDPR office would advise that regardless of the fact that the data has been made anonymous, just in case there is a possibility that, for example, for small cohorts, there might be a concern, it could be possible to identify someone at one of the institutions on the basis of the demographic data, that there should be a data transfer agreement in place. We don't have to write it. What will happen is that we'll contact our GDPR team and we ask them for advice and for a template for us to complete, and they would help us in terms of completion of that. And again, what they want to be certain of is that the data is all going to be protected, anonymized, and the confidentiality, privacy of all the participants is going to be protected by the sharing of that data. So we may not need one, but the advice is often that perhaps it's best to have one. Last question. Dr. Z has decided to move to another university. So they've accepted a new position, and the concern here is whether this is going to impact on their existing research. Now, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Dr. Z is the sole researcher named in this particular research project. If they move from University Z to another one, let's call it F for choosing a different letter, would they need to ask for ethical approval at their new institution, or would they be able to continue using the ethical approval granted by their original university for the project they've started? Ken, yes, it's correct. So they would not be able to carry on with their research and carry on collating data or collecting data, processing data that came from another institution at their new institution. So they would need, before they move on to the new university, to put in place or initiate ethical application to the new university so they could carry on with the data. That means that, if they wanted to make changes to their original application, their university, their original university, University Z, has no longer any oversight of what is happening with the data and what is being done with the data once Dr. Z moves out of the university to a new place. So they would need to apply for ethical approval at their new institution so they could carry on with their research and carry on using or collecting data from the university they came from. Now, the other question is, let's, for the sake of argument, go back to the extension of the original project. There were other people named in the application, not just Dr. Z. So if Dr. Z was a member of the research team, even if they were the lead applicant, would they need, as they move to another university, would they be able to continue using the ethics application granted by the original university if there was a wider research team present at their original project? So the privacy notice, I would assume that the privacy notice would apply for someone who is at Kingston using data from Kingston, rather than the privacy notice of the other university for which they moved on to. Now, if Dr. Z was one of the research team, what will happen is that if they were the lead applicant, the research team would be able to request an amendment and change the lead applicant to another member of the research team, which means they would be able to continue operating under the approved application, and Dr. Z would be a collaborator from another institution, would be added onto the research. So he's already there, but he becomes a member from another university, a collaborator from another university. But the project can continue with the existing ethics application. So if no data is being collated from other institutions, that in theory they would not need to request approval from their institution, and they would just carry on as a collaborator within the existing application. But if they were still responsible for a substantial amount of the work being done as part of the original application, what will happen is that they will need to apply for ethics approval within their new institution as well. So again, it also very much depends on whether they have a smaller role or a very large role within the existing research. And if it's a very large role, they would still need to apply for ethics application within the new institution. Okay, so I think we've sort of navigated different scenarios, and I'm hoping this has been helpful. I haven't come across all of these, but I've sort of thought about what could happen if some of these scenarios materialize. So as my last slide, I know I've only got 5 minutes left. I've got some tips to take away. So plan ahead. If you want to start a piece of educational research on the 1st of May, 2025, I would apply on the 1st of March, 2025. At Kingston, it can take up to 20 working days for you to get an initial response, which will often be revisions are needed, which means then you have to submit something afterwards. Check that there is training available to you. In all likelihood, you're going to be asked to complete mandatory GDPR training, even GDPR for researchers, and there's going to be ethics training that might be a requirement for you. If your university offers participant information sheet and consent form templates, please use them. The most common comments I write on any application are to do with missing information on the participant information sheet or the consent form, which would have been dealt with by using the templates provided by us. If there aren't, ask colleagues who've successfully applied for ethics approval before. Use plain language in your application. Remember, you are not reviewing your application. The committee is, and there might not be people that work within your area. And so you have to make sure that the language is plain, not just for the participants, but also for reviewers. Less is not more. A research ethics committee cannot fill the gaps in your application. So don't try to be too succinct, at which point you end up with lots of questions from the committee. And I think it's reasonable to accept that you should prepare for revisions. Assume you would always be asked for revisions. And if revisions are made, in any paperwork you resubmit, please make sure you highlight where those revisions were made, because we have to open all the documents and find where the changes were made. And if it's not clear to us, it will take much, much longer for us to go back to you because we have to find where all the changes were made. So this will certainly speed up our process of reviewing ethics applications. I think that's all I wanted to cover for today. So I'm hoping I'm answered some of your questions throughout the presentation, but I'm happy to answer any more questions that you might have, and I'm happy to answer any questions by email if you want to come back to me afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. I think we've got time for one question, if anybody wants to put it in the chat.
I'm afraid there's no AI engine that I'm aware of. Obviously, the concern is that whether you're using, if you're giving data to the AI engine, then obviously it becomes part of the training material for that engine potentially. But you can use AI engines to revise the wording used in an application. You can use an AI engine to provide you feedback on the participant information sheet and whether it's clear and whether you've addressed all the questions being asked by a committee as well. So that's certainly something that you're perfectly entitled to use, but you cannot upload any data to an AI engine afterwards as well. But in the same way you've seen, I've used AI tools to put together some of the infographics for this presentation. You can obviously ask questions of an AI tool around ethical concerns, hypothetical that might be raised by your research. You just obviously have to use your critical eye on the information that comes out of the AI, because we know it can hallucinate. It's getting better, but it can hallucinate as well. But I've often found it quite useful in terms of giving me ideas about things I haven't thought about. And I can...
Pedro, there's one question. Martin asks about publishing research after moving to a new institution. So I assume if we've got ethical approval where the research is covered, there would be no problem then?
So if you're moving to a new institution, I probably will be a data question that perhaps should go to your GDPR team around whether you can transfer the data that you've collected from an institution to another institution. I'm sure the GDPR team can advise you on that. if the data has already all been collated, you're not collecting any more data, and you're just simply in the process of analyzing your data, I think is a GDPR issue rather than an ethics issue in terms of continuing data collection after you've left. That's slightly different. You probably will need to find a collaborator and apply for ethics within your institution, because then you are a collaborator in an ongoing project that takes place at your original institution that you moved out of as well.
Okay, well, I think we're coming to our end of the time. I'd like to thank Pedro for quite an entertaining and informative talk, and hopefully it gives us a little bit of more guidance on seeking ethical approval, and perhaps not as onerous as we might think it is. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.